January 17, 1781. A frozen cattle pasture in upstate South Carolina sits silent under a pale winter sky. Across this field, a British officer named Banastre Tarleton rides forward with over 1,000 of the best trained soldiers in the British Army. He is 26 years old. He is Britain's most feared cavalry commander in the colonies, and he expects an easy slaughter. His target is a ragged American force, half of them untrained militia with a well-known reputation for breaking at the first sight of a bayonet charge. What Tarleton rode into instead was one of the most perfectly executed tactical traps in the history of warfare. Within 1 hour, his elite force would be shattered by farmers, shopkeepers, and backwoods riflemen. Within 1 hour, his elite force would be shattered by farmers, shopkeepers, and backwoods riflemen. What he had was something far more dangerous, a complete and honest understanding of how men behave when they are terrified. The battle plan he built around that understanding is still studied at West Point today. South Carolina in late 1780 was a disaster for the American cause. The British had captured Charleston in May, taking over 5,000 Continental soldiers prisoner. It was the single worst American defeat of the entire war. Lord Cornwallis now controlled most of the southern colonies. Loyalist militias were terrorizing patriot families across the countryside. The revolution was on the verge of total collapse in the South. At the Battle of Cowpens, General Horatio Gates's army was crushed. The militia fled immediately under the British bayonet charge, leaving the Continentals exposed. General George Washington sent Nathanael Greene to take command of what remained of the Southern Continental Army. What Greene found was barely an army, roughly 1,400 starving, poorly equipped regulars scattered across the Carolina backcountry. Greene made a decision that most commanders would have called reckless. He split his already tiny force in two. He sent roughly 600 troops west under the command of Brigadier General Daniel Morgan, to threaten the British left flank and protect civilians between the Broad and Pacolet rivers. Daniel Morgan was born poor in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He worked as a teamster hauling supplies through the wilderness. There was no wealthy family behind him, no aristocratic pedigree, no formal military education of any kind. During the French and Indian War, Morgan received 499 lashes from a British officer for striking a superior. The scars covered his entire back for the rest of his life. Morgan reportedly joked that the British still owed him 1 lash. The drummer had miscounted. That kind of man does not forget, and he does not forgive. When the Revolution began, Morgan led a company of Virginia riflemen and fought in nearly every significant engagement of the northern campaigns. At the Siege of Quebec in 1775, he took a musket ball through the neck and kept fighting before being captured by the British. He was exchanged in 1777 and placed by Washington in command of Morgan's riflemen, 500 hand-picked sharpshooters. At Saratoga in 1777, his riflemen helped shatter Burgoyne's army in the engagement that convinced France to enter the war on the American side. Morgan left the army in 1779, bitter over being passed over for promotion and crippled by severe sciatica. He returned to service in 1780 as a newly promoted brigadier general. Morgan had fought alongside militia at Saratoga and watched them perform brilliantly from the treeline. He had also watched them collapse entirely at Camden under a bayonet charge. Morgan refused to dismiss militia as cowards. He understood that asking untrained civilians to stand against British regulars in open field was a mismatch of capability, not courage. This honest assessment of what his men could and could not do became the foundation of the entire trap he was about to build. Banastre Tarleton had built one of the most feared reputations in the colonies. In December 1776, he surprised and captured American General Charles Lee in New Jersey. He served with distinction at the Siege of Charleston and the Battle of Cowpens, commanding the British Legion, an elite mixed infantry and cavalry force. At the Battle of Waxhaws in 1780, his dragoons were accused of cutting down surrendering American soldiers, earning him the permanent nickname Bloody Tarleton among the colonists. His military philosophy was built on 3 pillars: speed, shock, and the bayonet. Every encounter with American militia had confirmed his belief that a hard, fast assault would always break them. On January 1, 1781, Cornwallis ordered Tarleton west based on false intelligence that Morgan was targeting the Loyalist fort at 96. Tarleton marched to 96, discovered Morgan was not there, requested British regular reinforcements, and set out again with an enlarged force of over 1,150 men. His force included the British Legion with 250 cavalry and 200 infantry, the 17th Light Dragoons, 2 3-pounder cannons, the 7th and 71st Regiments of Foot, and various Loyalist units. By January 12, Tarleton had accurate intelligence on Morgan's location and began a brutal forced march through freezing temperatures and flooded rivers. In the 48 hours before the battle, his troops had less than 4 hours of sleep and had completely run out of food. At 2 a.m. on January 17, Tarleton roused his exhausted men and marched them 8 miles through pitch darkness across swollen creeks before dawn. Tarleton sensed victory, and nothing would persuade him to delay. He had chased Morgan for days, and he was not stopping now. When Morgan learned Tarleton was in fast pursuit, he had 2 options: run and link back up with Greene, or stop and fight. By the afternoon of January 16, Morgan reached Cowpens, a well-known local cattle grazing area in northern South Carolina, and decided to make his stand. His officers were confused. The position seemed catastrophic. The broad river sat roughly 5 miles behind them, cutting off any retreat. Open ground stretched in every direction, no forest cover, no swamp to slow a cavalry charge, no natural fortification of any kind. Morgan chose this ground deliberately. He did not want his militia to have an escape route. He knew that if they could run, they would run. By placing the river at their backs, he removed the option entirely. Fight or drown. The terrain was not a liability, it was a mechanism. The open ground would funnel Tarleton into a direct frontal assault, exactly where Morgan needed him. 2 gentle hills concealed the cavalry reserve from any approaching British force. The terrain encouraged Tarleton's natural instinct, a hard, fast frontal charge. Morgan was not setting a trap for his own army. He was setting one for the enemy. Morgan spent the entire night of January 16 moving from campfire to campfire across the frozen field, personally explaining the plan to every single unit. He crouched down with groups of shivering militiamen, shared stories about fighting the British at Saratoga, told jokes, and made each man understand exactly what was expected of him. To the militia he said directly, "Give me 2 good fires, boys, and then you can fall back." That was the entire assignment. 2 shots and leave. To the Continental regulars he was equally clear. You are the wall and nothing gets past you. To Washington's cavalry, you will be the ones to finish it. Personal pre-battle leadership at this level was almost unheard of in 18th century warfare. By dawn, every soldier on that field knew his role, his timing, and his movement. The militia's withdrawal was not going to be a panic. It was going to be a rehearsed maneuver executed under fire. Morgan had turned a potential weakness into a scripted performance. Morgan arranged his forces in 3 deliberate lines, each set roughly 150 yards behind the last. The first line was approximately 150 select riflemen from Georgia and the Carolinas. These were frontier marksmen under McDowell and Cunningham, men capable of hitting targets at 250 yards with a long rifle. Morgan gave them one specific instruction: shoot the epaulets, target officers, men on horseback, anyone giving orders. Then fall back to the second line. Their purpose was to begin stripping British leadership before the main engagement even started, creating confusion at the moment of first contact. The second line was the main militia force, roughly 300 men from the Carolinas under Andrew Pickens. This was Morgan's most creative use of a perceived weakness. Their assignment was exactly 2 things: fire 2 aimed volleys when the British came within 50 yards, then turn left, circle behind the third line, and reform in the rear. Morgan built the entire battle around the certainty that they would do this. The withdrawal would look like a rout, and Morgan knew Tarleton would interpret it exactly that way. The third line was the backbone, approximately 450 to 550 Continental regulars and experienced Virginia militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard. The third line was the backbone, approximately 450 to 550 Continental regulars and experienced Virginia militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard. Completely hidden behind the second hill, invisible to any approaching British force, waited Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, a cousin of George Washington. His roughly 80 Continental dragoons and 45 mounted militia cavalry were the hammer. Their job: wait, watch, then thunder out at exactly the right moment and hit the British flank. The design was a double envelopment. Line 1 bleeds the British. Line 2 staggers and retreats, drawing a reckless charge. Line 3 stops it cold. Then cavalry and militia close the circle. Tarleton's vanguard emerged from the woods just before sunrise. His troops were exhausted, hungry, and running purely on adrenaline and aggression. He saw exactly what Morgan wanted him to see: a ragged American force with a river behind them and nowhere to run. Tarleton interpreted it as a gift. Tarleton ordered an immediate attack, no reconnaissance, no rest for his exhausted troops, no meaningful reserve held back. He formed his infantry into a wide assault line. Dragoons were placed on both flanks. The 2 3-pounder cannons were positioned between his regulars and loyalist infantry. The British battle line stretched across the full width of the field. Tarleton sent his dragoons forward first against the American skirmish line. The frontier riflemen opened fire from long range and 15 dragoons were shot from their horses. The British cavalry retreated. Without pausing to study the American deployment, Tarleton immediately ordered an infantry charge. This was his first fatal mistake. The American riflemen fire, reload, fire again, then melt backward toward the second line exactly as Morgan had planned. They had already done serious damage. The British infantry advanced in regular formation, drums beating, bayonets leveled, regimental colors flying. This was the moment British regulars lived for. A charge against undisciplined colonials who would break and flee, or so every British officer on that field believed with absolute certainty. At 50 yards, Andrew Pickens gave the order. 300 muskets fired simultaneously into the British ranks at close range. The volley was devastating. Entire sections of the British line crumpled. 40% of British casualties in this phase were officers. The riflemen had done their precise, lethal work. The militia reloaded with shaking hands and fired a second volley into the staggering British formation. Then, exactly as Morgan had told them, they turned and began moving left. Some jogged, some walked, some glanced back over their shoulders at the redcoats screaming behind them, but they moved together, following the route Morgan had walked them through the night before. They had done their job. 2 shots. And now they were leaving the stage exactly as the director had written it. When British officers saw the militia turning and moving away, they interpreted it as a complete collapse. The Americans were running. The line had broken. This was Camden all over again. The disciplined British advance dissolved instantly into a full-speed charge. Regimental cohesion was gone. Soldiers sprinted uphill in a mob, bayonets forward, every instinct telling them this fight was already won. They had chased American militia before. They knew exactly how this ended. They crested the low rise and ran directly into Howard's Continental line. Fresh troops, rested, standing shoulder to shoulder with muskets loaded and aimed. Lieutenant Colonel Howard waited. 40 yards, 30 yards. At near point-blank range, he gave the order to fire. The volley hit the disorganized British charge like a wall. Men fell by the dozen. Before survivors could even process what had happened, charge bayonets. Howard ordered a bayonet charge directly into the stunned, scattered British front. American regulars slammed into the redcoats at close quarters. For the first time, the British began to stumble backward. Meanwhile, Tarleton ordered the 71st Highlanders to flank the American right. Howard spotted the movement and ordered the Virginia militia to turn and face the Scots. In the noise and chaos of battle, Howard's order was misunderstood. The Virginia militia began to withdraw instead of wheeling to face the Highlanders. The British saw the withdrawal and believed the Americans were collapsing again. They charged in a chaotic mass, breaking formation entirely, racing to finish a victory they were certain was already theirs. Morgan ordered a volley. The Virginia militia suddenly stopped, made an about-face, and fired directly into the British pursuers at 30 yards. The trap within the trap. Even the mistake had become part of the plan. The British charge crumpled at 30 yards from a volley they never saw coming. At the exact moment the British front staggered, William Washington's cavalry thundered out from behind the second hill. 80 dragoons at full gallop, sabers drawn. The cavalry smashed directly into the exposed British right flank. A formation already reeling from Howard's frontal assault was now hit simultaneously from the side. Pickens, meanwhile, had marched his militia all the way around behind the Continental line. They reappeared on the opposite side of the field, reformed, loaded, and advancing. The British were being struck from the front by Howard's bayonet charge, from the right by Washington's cavalry, and from the left by Pickens' returning militia. A full double envelopment, a textbook encirclement, executed by farmers, shopkeepers, and backwoods riflemen against one of the most professional armies on earth. The British army did not break slowly or in stages. It shattered. Soldiers threw down their muskets and raised their hands. Officers tried to rally pockets of resistance. Combat shock, the accumulated effects of exhaustion, hunger, and sudden psychological reversal, seized the entire British force simultaneously. Tarleton rode back to his sole remaining intact unit, the cavalry of the British Legion. He ordered them to charge. They fled the field instead. The 71st Highlanders, surrounded on all sides, surrendered. British Major MacArthur, now a prisoner, stated, "I was an officer before Tarleton was born. The best troops in the service were put under that boy to be sacrificed." Tarleton found roughly 40 remaining cavalrymen and attempted to retrieve his cannons, already captured. He tried to countercharge Washington's cavalry. The two officers clashed personally on horseback in a swirling melee of sabers and pistol shots. Tarleton was wounded on his right hand. He creased Washington's knee with a pistol shot. Tarleton broke free and escaped with a handful of riders, fleeing the field at a dead gallop. Washington pursued him for 16 miles before breaking off the chase. The battle lasted approximately 1 hour. When the field fell silent, the numbers told a story that military historians still double-check because they barely seem possible. British losses: 110 killed in action, 229 wounded, 629 captured or missing. All artillerymen dead or severely wounded. Both cannons captured. Tarleton lost over 86% of his command, wiped out as a fighting force. One of the most effective mobile strike forces in the entire British Southern Theater, gone in 60 minutes. American losses: approximately 25 killed and 124 wounded. The kill ratio is the kind of result historians double-check because it barely seems possible. When Tarleton reached Cornwallis and reported the disaster, Cornwallis reportedly pressed his sword tip into the ground and leaned on it until the blade snapped. Man took the greatest weakness of his army, the unreliability of militia under direct assault, and made it the centerpiece of a trap. He used their retreat as bait. He made the British believe they were winning at the exact moment they were losing. Every movement was choreographed to pull the British deeper into a kill zone they never recognized. He did not fight the battle the British expected. He designed a battle the British could not resist, and then let their own aggression destroy them. Tarleton's instincts, speed, shock, pursuit, were turned against him at every single stage. The weapon that had always won his battles became the mechanism of his destruction. Morgan's personal walkthrough the night before was not morale-building. It was rehearsal. The militia's retreat was not a panic. It was a trained maneuver executed under fire. Morgan did not wish his militia was something they were not. He gave them a job they could actually do, and built the entire battle around the certainty of their limitations. Cowpens broke the back of British strategy in the south. Cornwallis lost a quarter of his light troops and his most aggressive field commander in a single morning. British commanders across the southern theater had built their entire strategy on the assumption that American militia always breaks under pressure. Morgan had just proven that assumption dead wrong. Cornwallis, furious, burned his own supply wagons to lighten his army and chase Greene north into North Carolina. The pursuit stretched his supply lines to the breaking point. Skirmishes followed at the Catawba River crossings, including the Battle of Cowpens Ford on February 1, 1781. The long chase into North Carolina draining British strength with every mile. Cornwallis met Greene at the Battle of Guilford Courthouse, winning tactically but suffering devastating losses that left his army too weak to hold the field. Cornwallis withdrew to Wilmington to rest and refit, and then moved into Virginia, straight into the trap that would end the war. Washington and his French ally Rochambeau seized the opportunity. A combined American and French force surrounded Cornwallis at Yorktown in October 1781. The British army that surrendered at Yorktown was still, in many ways, unraveling from what had happened at Cowpens 9 months earlier. Chief Justice John Marshall later assessed, "Seldom has a battle in which greater numbers were not engaged been so important in its consequences as that of Cowpens." Military scholars have compared the Battle of Cowpens to Hannibal's victory at Cannae in 216 BC, where Carthaginian forces lured Roman legions into a pocket by letting their center bend inward while the flanks closed. The comparison has been drawn for over 2 centuries. But Hannibal had veteran Carthaginian infantry and Numidian cavalry, warriors trained for years. Morgan did it with militia who had been farming corn 6 weeks earlier, on a cattle field, against an opponent who should have known better. And Morgan did it with a plan he personally walked every soldier through the night before. The Battle of Cowpens is taught at military academies today as a case study in the double envelopment, in understanding your own forces honestly, and in using an enemy's aggression against them. Historian John Buchanan wrote that Morgan may have been the only general in the American Revolution, on either side, to produce a significant original tactical thought. The battle proved definitively that militia, when deployed with realistic expectations and a plan built around their actual capabilities, could defeat experienced regulars, something American military and political leaders had previously considered impossible. Morgan had just rewritten the rules of what citizen soldiers could achieve. Tarleton spent the rest of the war attempting to explain what happened at Cowpens. He blamed his officers, his cavalry, and his troops, everyone but himself. His superiors blamed him for charging without reconnaissance. Cornwallis blamed the entire collapse of the Southern campaign on the losses of that single morning. None of them were prepared for a commander who had designed a battle around the enemy's own instincts, who had used Tarleton's aggression as the primary weapon against him. A national battlefield park sits on the site today. Markers show where each line stood and where Washington's cavalry launched their charge. The rolling pasture still looks much as it did in 1781. Green grass, gentle hills, open sky. Easy to stand there and forget what happened on this ground. For 1 hour on a freezing January morning, this patch of ground hosted one of the most lopsided victories in American military history. The men who fought here were not professional soldiers by trade. Most of them were farmers, hunters, and tradesmen. Men who had picked up muskets because they believed something was worth fighting for. A backwoods general with scars on his back and a personal grudge against the British Empire gave them a plan they could actually execute. The retreat was not a failure of the plan. The retreat was the plan. Every step backward was a step that pulled the enemy forward into destruction. Morgan understood something that most commanders refused to accept, that the foundation of effective command is ruthless honesty about what your army can actually do. He did not design a battle for the army he wished he had. He designed a battle for the army standing in front of him. And that distinction made all the difference. In under 60 minutes, on a frozen cattle field in South Carolina, that plan set in motion a chain of events that led directly to American independence. From that frozen January morning to Yorktown that October. From a cattle field in South Carolina to the birth of a nation. The chain of consequences was unbroken. Tarleton's brigade suffered an 86% casualty rate in 1 hour. Cornwallis lost a quarter of his light forces. The British Southern strategy never recovered. And at the center of all of it, a man who had grown up poor, been flogged by the army he would one day defeat, and who never forgot a single lash. Morgan, in arranging his battle lines at Cowpens, proposed to turn a weakness into a strength. His plan is studied to this day, and the lesson has never changed. Know your enemy's instincts, know your own army's limits, build the trap around both, and then let the enemy walk into it. That is the genius trap every military strategist knows. Cowpens is where it was executed most perfectly, by a backwoods general who owed the British one lash. The Battle of Cowpens, January 17, 1781. 1 hour, one trap, one general who understood his men well enough to make their greatest weakness into the weapon that won.